Hello, everybody. Oh, it's so good to see you. Shana Tova, welcome, welcome back. I'm seeing some very beloved and familiar faces and seeing some new faces, and all of you just look so wonderful and refreshed and ready for a new year. Shana Tova officially. Welcome and welcome back to everybody who's joining us in our Zoom room for members or are joining us from our wider community on our Facebook stream. It is wonderful to see you all. I'm Rabbi Sarah Berman. I am the Director of Adult Education here at Central Synagogue, and it is a pleasure to welcome you to our first holiday boot camp of 5782. It is a new series following after our High Holiday Boot Camp, but this is a new series in which we will do the same level of deep and serious learning and work together, getting ready for these holidays all year long. We're going to look at 5 holidays together over the course of the year with 5 incredible teachers and 1 amazing host. And you will get to meet our first teacher and our host in a moment. But first, I want to make sure that everybody knows in our Zoom room that you have been lovingly muted. I appreciate you all, and we do want to hear from you, but we will hear from you through your words in the chat box rather than your voices. The voices we will hear today are our host and our teacher. We are streaming today on Facebook live, and after the session, all of our videos will be available on Facebook, and within a few days, they will also be available on YouTube, where you can find all of our High Holiday videos as well. If you have questions here in the Zoom room, please put those into our chat box. We would love to hear from you throughout the session, throughout our learning together. And so without further ado, who are we learning from tonight? It is Rabbi Shai Held. I am thrilled to introduce him. He is the President, Dean, and Chair in Jewish Thought at Hadar. He's taught both theology and halakha at the Jewish Theological Seminary, the conservative movement seminary uptown, and he has served as the Director of Education at Harvard Hillel. He is the 2011 recipient of the prestigious Covenant Award for Excellence in Jewish Education. He holds a doctorate in religion from Harvard, and his first book, Abraham Joshua Heschel, The Call of Transcendence, was published by Indiana University Press in 2013. The Heart of Torah, a collection of essays on the Torah that is in 2 volumes, that was published by JPS in 2017. And my partner, the leader in this program, Abby Pograbin, is our host. She's a former president of Central Synagogue, is the author of 3 books, including My Jewish Year, 18 Holidays, One Wandering Jew, which was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. And one of my first tasks at Central Synagogue was writing a curriculum based on that book. So if you want to talk about it, let me know. Abby moderates public conversations for the Stryker Center, the Manhattan JCC, the UJA, the Shalom Hartman Institute, and of course, for us at Central Synagogue. Abby, welcome back. Rabbi Held, welcome.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Berman and Rabbi Held. We're treated with you again. For those who may know that I'm a little bit of a rabbi groupie when it comes to Jewish learning. We have some incredible teachers at Central, but I also sometimes go far afield, across town to Hadar, which is just an extraordinary place of learning and frankly, Jewish therapy in many ways. We can get into that later. Why to life and such urgency. Hey, you Shai, thank you for letting me call you Shai for efficiency here. We can hear your voice. You can say hello before I start to grill you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Abby. It's a privilege to be with you today.
So let's just start with, we want to orient ourselves. It may be obvious, but let's just be the Peshat for a minute and talk about this holiday and why we're here. We've just come through, obviously, a very intense 10 days of awe and movement and sitting in synagogue for a long time. Why are we kicked outside for Sukkot? It has always seemed, I will confess, before I started my own learning about the holidays, it always felt a bit like a non sequitur, which I know it is not. why are we celebrating Sukkot now? And how would you give the elevator pitch for what it's about? What is this holiday for?
Okay, so let me actually try to take those questions in order. Why are we doing this now? So this is a question that I think almost everyone who observes Jewish holidays on any level struggles with, because it's like September is just like another holiday starts every 12 minutes and you have to figure out what's going on. But I think what I would say about this is that I've come to understand over time that Yom Kippur needs Sukkot in order to reach its culmination, and Sukkot needs Yom Kippur in order for it to make sense. What I mean by that is, on Yom Kippur, we are essentially renewed. We come out, at least spiritually speaking, as if we were newborns. And in many ways, I think what Sukkot is about is, okay, now you've been forgiven, now you've been renewed, what are you going to build in the world? And the Sukkah is the metaphor for, okay, this has to point somewhere. It's not just a spiritual thing. The spiritual in Judaism always leads to the practical, to the concrete. So Sukkot is about taking the next step. That's why, by the way, there's a beautiful custom of starting to build the Sukkah just a few minutes after Yom Kippur ends, which I think is a symbolic way of expressing that idea. But I also think that Sukkot needs Yom Kippur in the sense that, when you try to build things in the world, you fail sometimes. You hurt people, you mess up, you misjudge, right? You misread a situation. And it's almost like without having just been reminded of the possibility of forgiveness and fresh starts, Sukkot would be too daunting a task, right? In other words, to me, that's actually quite moving because, as someone who's tried to build institutions in the world, you mess up. You're never perfect. And so I think there's something actually quite healing about the idea of Sukkot being preceded by Yom Kippur. Now, in terms of what this holiday is, I mean, we can get into this at much greater length, but I think what I love about Sukkot is that Pesach, Passover, and Shavuot are about things that happened in Jewish history. Passover is about the Exodus, as you know. Shavuot is about the revelation at Mount Sinai. And Sukkot, in a really interesting way, is about the day-to-day quotidian march through the desert. And it's just so interesting to me that Judaism makes a holiday out of that, right? I always like to say, go ahead.
Before you get to the quotidian, the fact that you mentioned those two other holidays, Passover and Shavuot,
Yeah.
I think just some might not know, because I didn't, about the pilgrimage holidays, the fact that these are a triumvirate. And it's confusing to me, or it was certainly, the chronology of it, because it feels like we are first liberated, that's Passover. Shouldn't we be wandering and having Sukkot before we get to Sinai, Shavuot? I know this is probably not a simple answer, but just help us understand why that chronology is kind of a little wacky.
Yeah, by the way, here's something that people know but don't realize they know. The three pilgrimage festivals, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot, are called a Chag, which is the same word as the Arabic Hajj, meaning a pilgrimage, right? It's Chag and Hajj are the same word. So you actually know that it's a pilgrimage festival, even though you may not realize that you know it.
That's cool.
I think, and this is just my interpretation here, I'm not relying here on any traditional source, that one of the lessons of Sukkot, as Abby said, you would think that you would have Passover, and then you'd have the journey through the desert, Sukkot, and then you'd get to Sinai, Shavuot. But I think that what the calendar teaches us is that the wandering doesn't stop at Sinai. It's not like you leave Exodus and then you wander and then you finally get to Sinai. It's that you leave Egypt, you go to Sinai and get guidance for how to march through the world, and then you march. So that in many ways, I think it makes a lot of sense for Sukkot to come after Pesach and Shavuot. Pesach is the blueprint of liberation. Shavuot is the guidebook for how to build an alternative reality. And then Sukkot is walking with God through history.
And you said this idea of Yom Kippur, I love the idea of Yom Kippur and Sukkot needing each other, and we kind of need both holidays. But for many of us, I will say, Reform Jews, Sukkot isn't necessarily kind of in our top five. And I've heard many rabbis say that they really bemoan that we spend so much time in the pounding of the chest and sort of beating ourselves up, and that this is the holiday of joy and being outside and the fruits of the earth and sitting with guests and eating. We're allowed to eat all day if we want to. I guess before we leave the Yom Kippur into Sukkot transition, this idea that we are inside and doing very, not just literally inside, but doing very internal work, as I see it, of, when I say beating ourselves up, I'm obviously joking, but we're supposed to do real introspection, the hard work of atonement and apology and repentance. Is that intentional, that we are then essentially kicked outdoors?
I think it is, in the sense that, it goes back to something I said just a few minutes ago about how I think in Judaism, the spiritual is always reminded to not remain purely spiritual. Internal work is important, but it has to translate into the world. So being pushed outside is both literally and metaphorically being pushed outside, being asked to re-engage with the world. How does the work you've just done translate into the reality of building community, of building a society? So I think it actually is that. By the way, I think what I would add to your question is, it's not just Reform Jews for whom Sukkot has fallen down the list. It's also urban Jews, for obvious reasons. I think urban Jews have a hard time connecting to Sukkot. You wander the city looking for a sukkah to sit in. It just doesn't feel like what Sukkot is really about, which is, you right outside your house. Sorry?
They're on some fire escapes.
Yeah, exactly.
In the city.
Exactly. So there's, I think that it's a hard sell. It's one of the ways in which, look, I think a lot of Jews, I myself feel this a lot. Like, it has been a struggle for me to reconnect to how centrally agricultural these biblical festivals are. Because what do I know about agriculture? I went to high school on the Upper West Side. On the Upper East Side. It's like, it's very, very hard. So I think that there is something very profound here, but we have to re-immerse ourselves in a holiday that has fallen into kind of disuse, I would say, on the part of a lot of Reform Jews and a lot of urban Jews, let alone urban Reform Jews, which is, Central Synagogue, right? That's the struggle.
And I know Rabbi Ed Feinstein from California, but he said this thing to me that I never have forgotten. He said, Sukkot is a holiday that allows Jewish men to prove that they're handy. Which is a little bit sexist, but this idea that this is when we're building something for the first time. And I will be honest, I wrote in my book, I said I had sukkah envy because I didn't grow up with this. And when I interviewed rabbis and scholars, they talked about everything I'd missed, the joys of being outside, of building something, of sitting in it, of sleeping in it. Can you just give us a taste of your own kind of childhood Sukkot tradition? Did you put that first nail in when Yom Kippur was finished in your family? I know your father was a very famous rabbi. Was that part of the gestalt in the held home?
So my father was a famous academic, not a famous rabbi, and there's a difference there because, we did build a sukkah, but we didn't. I don't really know what it meant to my parents that we build a sukkah, in the sense that was never really talked about. It was never really, fed to me as a narrative. This is why we're doing what we're doing. It's just kind of what we did, because to them that was Jewish culture. To my parents, that's what Jews did. After Yom Kippur, they built a sukkah. But there is something, I don't even know how to explain it. I think that my memories of Sukkot, and I hope this doesn't sound downright bizarre. I'm a little nervous as I'm saying this, but is that I came from the kind of family where we spent so much time indoors reading, poring over books, that there was something so liberating about, like, oh, you know what this holiday is? You go and you sit inside it, and you eat food, and you schmooze across a table, and you're outdoors. Who goes outdoors? Right? So I'm being a little silly, but it was, to me, it was just something about, oh, Judaism does connect us to the earth that I think is lost in urban environments. So, those are more my memories. It's like, I remember the breeze during dinner. Like, that's my memory of Sukkot. I remember that.
Right.
It wasn't at all for me in that part of my life theological, or even, I don't think it was spiritual in an explicit way, but it was like reconnecting to, like, oh, we can sit outside and just enjoy the beauty of this.
And what about just we don't have to get into the minutia of the construction of the sukkah, but if you could just at least talk about the walls and the roof and the importance of the roof being open. What is the thinking there, the teaching?
Good. So let me say two quick things about this. One is that a few years ago, when I was writing the essays that became the Heart of Torah, I came upon this Kabbalistic commentary on Sukkot that took my breath away because it's so beautiful and I had never heard it. So according to Jewish law, you need to have two walls and a little bit, right? The sukkah, it's enough for the sukkah to be two full walls and then a little bit of a third wall. And the Kabbalists described that as God's arm, God's forearm, and God's hand. So you have three walls, 1, 2, 3, and it's God's embrace. And so walking into the sukkah is walking into God's embrace. I just find that to be so incredibly beautiful and aspirational. And I find myself wondering what it would take for me to feel that every time I went into the sukkah, I think, which is in itself really interesting. So that's really powerful. The roof. So one of the things that I really love about Sukkot is that I think among its many meanings is that it forces us to confront vulnerability. And I don't know how good most of us are most of the time at admitting the depth of our own vulnerability. And vulnerability is important, I think, in Jewish theology in two ways. One is that it reminds us of our dependence on God. And two is that I think it's vulnerability that opens us up to the possibility of genuine compassion for one another. Because what I would say is vulnerability is what distinguishes pity from compassion. Pity is when I look down at someone and say, oh, you know what? I'm so sorry you're going through that. Couldn't happen to me, but, I'm sorry that it happened to you. The embrace of vulnerability says, I'm not going to reach down to you. I'm going to reach across to you because you're human and this happens. People get sick, people die, people lose their jobs, people have their spouses do terrible things to them. Like, I'm right here with you. And I think Sukkot is the holiday that is meant to instill in us vulnerability. And I think that actually, like in communities that are wealthy, Sukkot is enormously important in that way because it's easy to foster the illusion that you're invulnerable. I mean, there are many sermons to be written about COVID and Sukkot, about being reminded of vulnerability. I haven't written them, but
Yes.
I think that there's something to say there.
But and obviously we've seen the forest fires, we've seen Hurricane Ida, we've seen the floods. I mean, it's becoming, I think, more and more literal, the idea of fragility and vulnerability. I want to stick with that for a minute because I think you've got so many wheels turning for many of us. This idea of going out in this structure with none of our stuff, of not having the comforts, the Nespresso machine, maybe our favorite chair. Sometimes we forget just how dependent we are on our appliances, on our routines, on our comforts. And I'm not saying it can't be beautiful out there, but it's sort of unsettling to kind of go back to basics. And so I guess I would love, along with this idea of fragility, of materialism, the idea of kind of being conscious once a year of how much we've accumulated and how this holiday really strips it down.
It's funny. I'm now going to do the most annoying thing anybody can do as a public speaker. I want to tell you about a conversation I had with my 5-year-old the other day because it was kind of amazing. Apropos of this, he said to me out of the blue, he had heard from his brother about the Amish, and they were sort of laughing about what Amish lifestyle was like. And out of the blue, sitting with me on Shabbat, he says to me, I was just thinking, and he's 5, I was just thinking, it's wrong to make fun of the Amish because on Shabbat, we try to be like the Amish. In that, like, we don't use all of the stuff that makes us modern. And I was like, wow, that's an interesting comment, right? I mean, and I think there is something to that. Shabbat is about, on some level, depending on what your vision of Shabbat observance is, but a traditional halachic Shabbat, one of the powers that it's engaging in is what does it mean to actually stop and enjoy the world as it is and savor the world as it is and be grateful for the world as it is, rather than trying to alter it and transform it through technology and electricity and light and fire and all of that. So yeah, I think that in many ways there's something, I just talked about Sukkot and COVID, lahavdil, to make a real distinction here, there's something to talk about between Sukkot and Shabbat, which I think are in different ways about struggling with materialism. I'll tell you, one other quick thing about Shabbat that I find really powerful. Now, this is about traditional halachic observance of Shabbat, but it's something that has become very important to me in my own experience of Shabbat. I love the fact that traditional Jewish law forbids you from handling money on Shabbat, because that is a radical egalitarianizing reality. On Shabbat, the wealthiest philanthropist in America and Warren Buffett and I, have the same in our wallet, as it were.
Mm.
And so the fact that we are ultimately equal as images of God, rather than that we are stratified in the ways we are in society, is really, really important. Unfortunately, we don't talk about that very much, but I think in a society struggling with the meaning and the limits of inequality, that Shabbat practice is actually quite moving and powerful. And I think it also connects in some ways to Sukkot, of letting go of all the stuff.
I hope you saw, Shai, in the chat that Harriet said "smart kid," which you absolutely have. A very smart kid, and a very cute one too. And I want to remind people to put your questions in the chat, because we'll be getting to them. Before we just leave, actually, the actual kind of practicality of the sukkah. The Sukkot means huts, am I right? Or that's one translation. So what is the story? Is the story that we built these temporary dwellings, each place we stopped and moved on? Were they not tents? What is sort of the historical underpinning of the Sukkot?
Well, so when you ask the historical underpinning, I don't know if we know the historical underpinning. The theological, mythical underpinning is that as we marched through the desert, we built these huts to protect ourselves from the elements. Although really interestingly, as you may know, there's a debate among the Talmudic sages about whether the Sukkot are commemorations of the huts that the Israelites built, or whether they are commemorations of the clouds of divine glory that hovered over the camp. And what's interesting about that debate on one level seems like frivolous, like what are they arguing about? But I think it's actually quite profound. Is Sukkot fundamentally about reconstructing something that we did in our fidelity towards God? Or is it about reconstructing something God did in God's fidelity towards us? Right? And ideally, I would say, I mean, here's just, my own instinct about this is, why not both? Right? Why not find ways to say this is about what we were willing to do to march with God and what God did to march with us? How literally we take that, we can talk about. But I think there's something actually quite powerful there. How historical that is, I think that's probably lost in the mists of a long ago past. But
right. Yeah, but I misspoke there. I didn't mean that sort of historically, meaning what is taught. But let's go back to those clouds of glory for a minute. It's multiple clouds, Shai, not just one cloud, and that God essentially is creating an umbrella over us, which I think is such a beautiful image. Right. Is there this sense that the part of this holiday is God's protection, that we are kind of, we are escorted? And should that be something that's kind of operating for us each year as we think about this, that God's with us?
It's really interesting. And I have struggled with this because the ways in which I just talked about how Sukkot is about being vulnerable. And yet the clouds of glory are supposed to be a symbol of God's providential care. And so we're vulnerable, but also God is with us. And that leads, I think, lots of modern Jews to wonder, what do we mean by God's providential care, if we mean anything at all by it, right? In other words, so, I struggle with this a lot. What do we mean when we say, actually, let me put it differently. I think it is far easier for many Jews to say, I believe in God, than it is for them to say, I trust in God. I think a lot of Jews, we're not clear what we mean when we say we trust in God. We trust that God's going to do what exactly? So it maybe is telling that I started by emphasizing Sukkot as about embracing vulnerability, whereas you then just put on the table, I think in an important way, but it's not only vulnerability. It's also God's presence with us in the very midst of our vulnerability. That's what the desert wandering is. I mean, if you think about the story of the manna in the book of Exodus, chapter 16, right? The people have to learn in a funny way to be dependent. In Egypt, they were dependent on a tyrant, and therefore life was miserable. So they're not being taught to abandon dependence. They're being taught to go from depending on a tyrant to depending on a God who loves them. And that's supposed to be a totally different kind of dependence that we might call healthy dependence. The dependence that hopefully we have on when we have good parents or something like that. So I don't know if I'm really answering your question,
Yeah.
but I think it's actually a really interesting and
Well,
hard one.
And I want to just follow up on what you said about our difficulty in trusting in God. Maybe it's easier to believe in God. Let's talk about that trust for just a second, because we know from the Bible that we were a very kind of ornery and fetchy and doubting people when we were wandering, right? Like, why did we leave Egypt? Maybe we should go back there. There's no water here. There's too much heat. There's terrible food. We don't know where we're going. This sense of trusting, whether it was Moses, God, whoever was leading us, what does this holiday kind of tell us about our, not just doubt, skepticism? We weren't exactly good soldiers, and we weren't exactly very faithful, it feels like, at this point.
Yeah, well, one of the things that's interesting biblically is that the Bible seems to have two very different memories of the time in the desert. There's the one that you get from reading the Chumash, the Pentateuch, and then you come upon something like imagine Jeremiah hearing God say, I remember how you loved me when you were young, how you walked after me in the desert and were faithful. And if you've just read the Chumash, the Pentateuch, you're like, wait, Jeremiah, what planet are you on? Right? There are these two very different ways of remembering what happened, which I think is I don't know what, is certainly interesting, but I'm not sure what else quite to do with that. I think that there is, to me at least, there is a longing in Sukkot, which is how I would respond to your kind of, I think, really interesting observation about, the wandering through the desert was not all that. It was really complicated. There is a longing for what it would look like to walk through history with enough trust in God that we could live in temporary dwellings, and enough faithfulness from God that God would hover over us. That's not the reality that many of us inhabit much of the time. And there's something, I think, longing, almost mythically longing, in the experience of Sukkot that is very moving. About your comment, if I could, about a time of doubting. So when I was young, I used to think to myself, if only God was manifest in the world, we would all be believers, and wouldn't that be great? And then one day I was reading the book of Exodus, and I was like, God was, according to this story, God was dramatically manifest in the world. And you know how much the people believed? Very, very little. Maybe that's not the problem. I don't know. I mean, I struggle with this a lot. The philosopher side of me, like, one of the great debates in contemporary philosophy is the question of divine hiddenness. If there's a God who wants us to love God, why is there what they call non-culpable non-belief? Why are there people who are honest, open-hearted, open-minded, and can't find God? Right? There's really interesting questions there. But the idea that, oh, if there were revealed miracles in the world, we'd all be people of profound faith, I think the Bible is interested in dispelling that, which is interesting.
Yeah. Let's go to joy for a minute, because as I read in your teaching in your wonderful book, this is the holiday that actually commands joy. And that is not an easy kind of concept for those of us Jews who wake up and find everything to complain about and to not be joyful about. But this idea that it's Zman Simchatenu, that Sukkot is the time of our joy, why this holiday, and what does that actually mean to be commanded to rejoice?
Yeah, so I think that brings me back all the way to where we started, to Pesach and Shavuot. You would maybe expect that the Exodus would be the time of our joy, or surely the revelation at Sinai. Jews love Torah so much. Sinai would be the time of our joy. But in fact, the Torah goes out of its way to emphasize that it is Sukkot that is a time of our joy. And that, to me, is a suggestion that ultimately the real work of covenant, the real work of living with God, the real work of living a faithful life is not about how I am on 8 or 10 or 15 days a year, but it's how I am on Tuesday morning, right? That's what I mean. Sukkot is very strange. It's a holiday that celebrates the non-holiday time. It's about nothing in particular, but just walking with God through the world. And there's something, I think almost, I mean, the word I'm tempted to use is subversive about the idea that this is the time of our joy. I mean, look, agriculturally, we can say there's a harvest, so it's a time of great joy. But in terms of the historical connections of the holidays, it's really interesting. It's sort of suggesting in a way that from one perspective, Tuesday morning, a random Tuesday morning is more holy and more worthy of joy than a holiday. And then we have the paradox of a holiday meant to celebrate the non-holiday, which is like a great Jewish move, right? It's like crazy dialectic. Um, so yeah, I think that there's something beautiful about calling that the time of our joy. Now, as for joy being commanded, I think what I would say about that, and this is not a full answer to the question, but the way that Jewish sources tend to talk about being commanded to feel things is by acknowledging you can't just decide, I'm going to feel joy now, or I'm going to walk up to someone and love my neighbor, but you can cultivate feelings. Feelings can be nurtured. I can act in ways that will elicit compassion. I can behave in ways that will elicit joy, right? The liturgy, the singing on Sukkot, right? Things like that are meant to elicit joy. They don't assume joy, they bring out joy. And that I think is a much healthier way of thinking, because people often get stuck on this. As you know, Abby, I spent a lot of time in the last few years talking about all over the country about various aspects of love in the Jewish tradition. And I can't tell you how often people will say, but how can you command a feeling? And my response, and that's also obviously a big issue in philosophy too. And my response to that is essentially, Aristotle says you can't decide to have a feeling, but you can do lots of other things that will make it more likely that you'll have a feeling. And maybe that's the mitzvah. Prepare the ground for the experience of joy.
I love that. And then it's kind of I would say discordant that we read Kohelet, Ecclesiastes on this holiday, which I don't necessarily think is thought of as the most joyful text. It's very fatalistic. It's a sense of a time to live, a time to die, a time to all of those things that we know from the song Turn, Turn, Turn. But it's also kind of like it's all going to go away. All this stuff you have, all this bounty isn't going to last. So kind of enjoy it while you can. Maybe I'm being reductive about Kohelet, but can you talk about, it's obviously not random that we read it during Sukkot, but what's the connection there, particularly when you're just talking about rejoicing and joy?
Yeah, well, I think that you actually just said something really important. One of the things Kohelet is about, and biblical studies has sort of embraced this idea a lot in the last, I would say, couple of decades, is that Kohelet is in many ways a prophet of pleasure, in that he basically says, if you want to hold on to things, you will be disappointed. And if you want to accumulate wealth, you'll end up cynical. But while you're here, there's an awful lot you can delight in. Just don't try to grab it. Don't try to keep it. If you try to keep it, you'll just end up being vexed. You'll end up being miserable and anxious. He talks about, wealth makes people anxious. What happens if I become unwealthy? But he doesn't. Kohelet is not a cynic. I think he actually seems to think life is about pleasure. Now, one of the ways, I don't know if maybe I overstated that. Life is not about pleasure, but what you can do in order to enjoy life and feel truly alive is partake in pleasure.
Mm.
Now, I think also, though, that Kohelet in many ways pushes the envelope on what Sukkot acknowledges. The things we build are fragile. Halakha the Jewish law regards it as almost a tragedy when on the first night of Sukkot it's raining. Because, well, how am I supposed to do this? I built this structure to be with God, and God's essentially like, shooing me away. And I think that Kohelet is about giving some space to the radical experience of, everything really is vulnerable. I could lose everything that I have.
Mm.
I used to, this is not my proudest moment, but I once said to a group of um, very high-powered Jewish communal philanthropists who were, kind of complaining about Sukkot and I don't connect to it. And this, and it's like, I don't, the whole vulnerability thing doesn't speak to me. And I said, I was a lot younger then, but I said, when you go out of this room and step into the elevator, you could have an aneurysm. And it doesn't matter how many billions you have. It doesn't actually matter. I'm not suggesting that, inequality in our society isn't real. I don't mean to be Pollyannish and say, oh, you're just as vulnerable as other people. You're not. But if you think you're not vulnerable, you ought to take Sukkot really seriously. You are quite vulnerable. All of us are very vulnerable. So I think there's something important there. The other thing is, to me, one of the most moving things that Jews do, we on Sukkot, on Shabbat of Chol HaMoed Sukkot traditionally, we say the Hallel, the Psalms of joyous celebration, and recite Kohelet within 15 minutes of each other. And that is something I think is really important. That is a training in the spiritual art of capaciousness, right? I can say in the same half hour, this is all just fleeting. And oh my God, this is a day that God has made. Let us rejoice in it. And I can hold both of those realities and experiences. And that's part of the spiritual work of Sukkot, and for that matter of being a Jew, I think. It's about being able
And
to
what
hold.
about,
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I think all of that is incredible and true. I just want to push you a little bit on vulnerability and get a little bit away from the fragility of wealth, which is real. And as you said, the sort of we could die tomorrow, but the vulnerability of relationships, of our souls, of our psyches.
Right.
Does this holiday speak to you, or can you help us kind of see it as, there's something in that metaphor of sitting unprotected with an open roof and walls that really can't stop the wind? I mean, is there something just about whatever we're going through personally that this holiday speaks to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is something there about, Yom Kippur, we've just come out of a period that is about acknowledging and reflecting the relationships in our life and the ruptures that have taken place in them. And there's actually, I think, something very moving about then physically going into a space that is vulnerable. We just were reminded that our relationships are vulnerable, that, that we can hurt, especially the people that we love most, that we can, say something that we think one thing about and someone else hears something totally different than what we said or what we intended to say, right? And so, I think that there's something powerful about the metaphor. I think that the biblical and rabbinic tradition would resist just spiritualizing Sukkot, but would be open to also spiritualizing Sukkot, if that makes sense, right? Just to say, yeah, I mean, lots of things are vulnerable, and it's not just my house or my wealth. It's also my marriage, my friendships, my relationship with my students. They're all vulnerable, right? People who have the best marriages in the world, imagine you do something completely unimaginably out of character and horrible. Well, your marriage may never be quite the same thing again, right? And so there's a way in which reflecting on vulnerability is, of course, in some profound way, also about our relationships. I think about that a lot. Now I had kids when I was old. I have little kids. I think about, the fragility of the ego of children. You say something to one kid that they find hilarious. You say it to their sibling and they find it devastating. Or you say something to a kid when they're 11 and they love it. And you say it to them when they're 13 and they tell you to get the hell away from them. Right? And there's just a lot of vulnerability in our relationships. There's a lot. Right? And I'm still waiting for the moment when my oldest kid rolls his eyes and tells me to go away because he's talking with his friends, right? I mean, I'm like dreading that, and it's coming, right? So I think, yeah, there is something very powerful and moving there.
And what about just the idea of bounty? We haven't really talked a lot about the agricultural harvest part of this, but what I was reading that you've talked about before is this reminder that it's kind of like you didn't build this. Like all of this stuff you've been given, look at it. It's miraculous. It's incredible. And you're outdoors in this gorgeous land, and you're able to eat from it. And hopefully you have abundance is there also just a reminder, not just of gratitude and guilt, but like, just don't forget that this is all a gift you didn't earn.
Yeah, right. I mean, so, the central teaching in many ways, you could say, or one of the couple of central teachings of the book of Deuteronomy, especially, is I, God, want to bless you, but blessings are a double-edged sword because they tend to lead to smugness and self-satisfaction. And I am begging you, always remember how much was done for you rather than how much you did yourself. You've probably heard me say this because it's my favorite quote, even though apparently he didn't really say it. But attributed to Mark Twain is this amazing quote that a self-made man is like a self-laid egg, which I just adore that quote. I think it's so profound. It's like Deuteronomy wishes it said that. A self-made man is like a self-laid egg. It's a lie. It's always and everywhere a lie. Um, and I think there's something very, very moving about that. So the bounty is about recognizing not how much I did, but how much I've been given. And that's hard for a lot of people. It's hard in the discourse of, I did it all myself. I made it. I remember that, here I am thinking back on that discussion again. When I was meeting with this group of donors, one of them, I said something about gratitude, and one of them said, I work really hard. And I said to him, I have no doubt that you work really hard, but I'm curious what you think. Who works harder, you or the guy who smears cream cheese on a bagel for 12 and a half hours a day? Like, please don't tell yourself that everything you have, you earned. Please don't tell yourself that, because it's not only toxic for your relationship with others, it's also lying to yourself. That doesn't mean, Deuteronomy is very profound here. Deuteronomy says that you should not say, I did it all myself, but you should know that God gave you the power to do it. Not that God did it for you, but that the skills that you have, the brain that is able to, I think about this all the time in my own life, so I'm very lucky in that I get to read and think and teach for much of my life. If I didn't have a natural ability to speak clearly, I couldn't do what I do. So I've worked incredibly hard, but I didn't make that. That was a gift. And we all have versions of that.
So maybe this is an unfair question, but for those who struggle with belief, a lot of what you've talked about is kind of a covenantal relationship with
Right.
God, what God did in taking us out of Egypt, a sense almost of a conversation with the divine, both on Yom Kippur and in the Sukkah. Are we kind of written out of this story if we're struggling with our belief?
So this leads me to want to share with you that there is a question that has driven me crazy over many years that I feel like I don't fully, the philosopher in me does not fully know how to talk about. And it's basically this, and you'll see in a second why I'm saying this in direct response to your question. So I talk a lot in my writing and in my teaching about grace, the idea that God gives us stuff that we didn't earn, and yet there it is. And beginning with the gift of life. None of us ever could have earned life or consciousness. It's all grace. And then I find myself thinking, but what if a lot of it is just luck rather than grace? What if there's an awful lot of randomness to it? I mean, the fact that I, Shai Held, was born into a society in which I was likely to have enough food, even though I went through great tragedy in my life. Lost a parent when I was a kid, was left with a parent who couldn't take care of me. I had my share of deprivation, and yet, I was never hungry, right? And is that grace? I mean, it is grace, but it's also luck. Because I don't really think that God chose me to have food, but a child in Sri Lanka was chosen to be hungry. That's not how I see God working in the world. So what are the moral, I have a lot to say about the moral implications of grace, but what are the moral implications of luck? That is a really hard question. And I like to think that the moral implications are the same, but I'm not completely sure how to formulate that. And it's a question that keeps me up, as it were, keeps me up at night. I don't think that I would just say in general, the story does not leave people out. It asks us to do some imaginative work, to imagine ourselves into the story. I mean, I'll give you an example of this. When I traveled around the country talking about my Heschel book, the single best question anyone asked me was Eric Alterman, journalist, at a session I did at B'nai Jeshurun. Eric said the following amazing thing. He said, can you explain American Jews to me? American Jews are a society of Kaplanians who all worship Heschel. One of the most profound questions I'd ever been asked, right? Everyone loves Heschel, but most American Jews, if you ask them, would probably believe more like Kaplan than like Heschel, right? They don't believe in a supernatural God. They don't believe in a God who's providential, right? And what I
Let's
said to
remind
Eric,
people who Kaplan is.
sorry, yes. So Mordechai Kaplan was the founder of the Reconstructionist movement and what can be called a religious naturalist, right? That is to say, he didn't believe that there was a God who was the creator. He didn't believe in a God who had personality. God was more of a process in the universe. And the answer that I gave to Eric that night is an answer. I've been thinking about that question literally ever since. It's now like 8 years ago that I'm not sure I was right about, but it was what popped into my head when he asked it is the thing about Kaplan for American Jews is that it's not aspirational. The things they don't believe, he doesn't believe either. And there's something a little boring about that. Whereas Heschel is an aspirational figure. Oh, I want to have a relationship with a personal God who loves me and cares about the widow and the orphan. That would be fascinating and liberating and wonderful. Scary, but also that. So, so I guess I think that these holidays are aspirational in some sense. But also, look, more generally, I would argue that for Judaism, what matters is what your questions are, right? There's a story that I often share about the Kotzker Rebbe, one of the great Hasidic masters, that a student comes to the Kotzker Rebbe and says, Rebbe, I don't think I believe in God. And the Kotzker says, yeah, what do you care? The student says, what do you mean, what do I care? I mean, if there's no God, then why do I keep mitzvot? Kotzker says, okay, why do you care? Students now, he gets all anxious and says, but Rebbe, like, what do you mean? If I don't believe in God, then I don't know why I do the commandments. Then I don't know why I do anything. Kotzker goes, what do you care? Finally, the students start screaming at him and says, Rebbe, if there's no God, and I don't know why I do the commandments, and I'm not even sure what the meaning of my life is, I don't know why I do anything. The Kotzker says to him, oh, you really care? Du bist a kosher Yid. You are a kosher Jew. I think about that story all the time because, if
You're
teaching
wrestling.
theology, if the prerequisite for teaching theology was being 100% sure of things, I would be out of business tomorrow. What allows me to teach theology is the fact that these questions stay with me day and night. And I'm invested in helping other people have the language to think about those questions. And so I don't think any holiday leaves people behind if they can imagine their way in. But it takes some work, meaning if you see the words, blessed are you, God, and you're like, done with that. So that's hard. But is there a way that you can find yourself imaginatively into that discourse? That's, I think, a really important question.
Yeah. I want to, speaking of questions, go to some of our wonderful questions. You're also getting a lot of commentary that is, we've got a lot of wonderful rabbinic commentary from Central Synagogue and our guests here. But Ed is asking, and I think Karen as well, about Ushpizin, the tradition of inviting, it's ancestral guests, not right. Literal guests, right? I mean, we all see that we have contemporary live people there. But tell us about Ushpizin and what's the point of that?
Yeah, I have a less developed answer for this than I would like to. I mean, Ushpizin is originally a Kabbalistic practice of welcoming ancestors into our sukkah, and traditionally, it's a particular group of male ancestors. Ushpizin has been, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, etc. Ushpizin in contemporary Jewish life, and Abby, you may have more to say about this than I do, actually, in terms of the research that you've done and the interviews you've done. Ushpizin has become, like, for all kinds of Jews, a way of inviting people who matter to them or whose memory is an inspiration to them into their sukkah. So I was just looking today that, Keshed, an organization that is committed to the greater inclusivity towards gays and lesbians, people who identify as queer in Jewish life. They put out a series of Ushpizin who are Jews who probably because of their sexuality could not have felt as fully included in the Jewish community as they wanted to, but had a major impact on society. Now, on one level, that's a very far journey from what the Kabbalists had in mind by Ushpizin. On the other hand, it's like a deep, I mean this in a positive sense of this word, appropriation of that custom into our own lives. So, I mean, Ushpizin is, I think, welcoming people who have been profoundly central to the unfolding of the relationship of God and Israel into our space and celebrating with them in some sense.
No, it's nice. We haven't talked about the 4 species, lulav and etrog. Also kind of confusing for people. I will speak for myself. Never have been able to memorize exactly, what we're waving where. But help us understand why these species, and maybe touch on the sexuality if you're comfortable. We don't want to make this too X-rated, as to why there is sensual imagery there, or many have perceived it or described it as such.
Yeah. So, I think here we go back to the agricultural festival side of this, where we celebrate the beauties of the natural world. And I think it's interesting that the sages, who may have had less of a relationship with the natural world, were very quick to turn the lulav and the etrog and the other into metaphors. So, like, the 4 species are 4 different kinds of Jews, are right, all this kind of like metaphorical development. But I think on some level, they're about connecting to the natural world. It smells, it sights, the ways that it's all, go back to your word, Abby, bounty, the way that it's all bounty. The waving the lulav around, to me, one of the things I really like about it is that it reminds me to sort of meditate on the idea that God is not just up there somewhere, but truly everywhere. And there again, we go back to the aspirational. What would it mean to live as if that were true? What would it mean to believe that all the time as opposed to sometimes or once in a while? I find that just a helpful thing to think about and reflect on. I don't have a lot of insight into the sexuality piece of this. The idea, of course, we have the phallus, the lulav as a symbol of the phallus. I would be open to people's own. I really don't feel like I have so much to say about this.
I've heard about the thrusting.
Yeah, I think that is connected to harvest and fertility. And in that sense, is it from some original? Does it derive from some pagan practice that's about stirring up fertility in the world? Perhaps. I'm not really sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Someone's asking about how urban dwellers, you touched on this, those of us who are in cities, how do we channel the connection with nature and fragility, even in our high rises?
Yeah, so it's such an interesting question. I mean, I will be honest with you and say I like Sukkot much more now that I moved to a suburb. Because, like I said, I used to wander around the city looking for a sukkah to make kiddush in on Yom Kippur night. Look, here's the thing. It's sort of ironic that New Yorkers have a space set aside for nature rather than the other way around. But, like, go for a walk in Central Park and notice things about nature that you never noticed there, right? I mean, there's actually, gorgeous nature. Plus, many people who live in high rises have the opportunity to either take their car or rent a car and go look at fall foliage, think about vulnerability. I mean, I think that we have to make, the difference is if you're in an urban environment, you have to make some effort to reflect upon these themes. It's not natural. I mean, literally, and I use that word, advisedly, but it's not like we're living in, an urban wasteland where there is nothing natural to see for thousands of miles around. I mean, there is plenty. I mean, yeah. Many of us even have friends whose sukkahs we can visit, who don't live in the city. I mean, I think that there's a lot to all that.
Yeah. Rabbi Berman is asking a whole other, it's actually, she's talking about Hevel, but is it Hevel or Hevel?
Hevel with it.
In Ecclesiastes, and I was going to say it's on a whole other level, which is like a really my bad humor post Yom Kippur. But she's saying it means both vanity and breath, which I love. And if you could just talk briefly about that connection from Kohelet.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. So I've been doing some work on this in a more like academic vein on the book of Ecclesiastes on Kohelet, and there is constant battle among academics about what on earth the word Hevel actually means. I mean, it is endless, and it goes round and round and round. And the most recent phenomenon is that people have just started transliterating it because, and for a really interesting reason, because they think it means different things in different parts of the book. And so rather than give 7 different translations for Hevel, just keep the word there and let people wrestle with it. I think that it does mean breath, and it seems to mean fleetingness. That's why Cain's brother is also named Hevel, because his life is fleeting and short. And Ecclesiastes is interested in the idea, I think, that we are all like Hevel. Our lives are fleeting and short and less secure and grounded than we might like to convince ourselves. To me, though, the Hevel idea is connected to the pleasure idea we spoke about earlier. It's all Hevel in that it will disappear, but it's not all worthless. And it's quite pleasurable at times. He says, go enjoy your spouse, go enjoy your family, go enjoy your wine, right? Go enjoy your bread. So I think Hevel it pulls at the cord of, it's not what you think it is. But then you can be reminded also in the book, but it's not nothing either. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
And I think there's something, I don't know, liberating about that, especially us in a world in which most of us don't believe that, there are any guarantees. I can live a righteous life. I still might get hit by a bus tomorrow. I still might die, right? So there's something about, yeah, it is all Hevel. But what's the next sentence after it's all Hevel? It's all Hevel, therefore I'm a cynic, or it's all Hevel, and therefore I'm going to soak up the beauty while it lasts. I think that's part of Ecclesiastes' message.
So finally, Shai, I'm going to do moderator's prerogative here and ask the last question.
Yeah.
And so appreciate this. From Leviticus, which is what lays out what we're supposed to do on Sukkot, Leviticus 23, 42, 43, it says, for a 7-day period, you shall live in booths in order that your ensuing generations should know that I had the children of Israel live in booths when I took them out of the land of Egypt. I just want you to sort of finish by kind of addressing the reminder that God is, whether we believe or not, and I happen to, why does God want us to keep reminding the next generation that our ancestors lived in booths, that God had our ancestors do this? What do you think is the takeaway for you in the importance of returning to this image, to this idea, to this inheritance?
Well, I think that the answer to that question is, to me, deeply connected to the question of why on Passover we try to instill in our children the memory that they were slaves in Egypt. Not just that their ancestors were slaves, but that they were slaves and God liberated them. So on one level, kind of on an anthropological level, it's about making the story of the Jewish people and God our own, right? It is about, really inhabiting the story. Religion is, Santayana has this great line, religion is an alternative world to live in. It is about really an opportunity to step inside the Jewish story and make it fully our own. Why we dwelled in booths, I think, is a reminder that, to me, as a modern Jew, when I live in a community for whom so many people, God is sort of like a lost item, there's something about remembering a time when we just felt close. God felt close to us and we felt close to God, and God was right there over us in a cloud. There's something about that is so beautiful and so is such a radical alternative to the heavily secularized culture that we live in that there's something actually liberating about it. Imagine living in a world where you matter and matter ultimately, where you're loved and loved ultimately, where the people you belong to have been covenanted with and given a mission that matters eternally. That's what it's about.
Thank you, Rabbi Shai Held.
Thank
He
you.
is all over Hadar's website with wonderful lectures. If any of you want to learn more with Shai from a distance, hopefully in person too. I want to thank my
Soon.
central community. Yes, soon. My central community, my central family. It was great to be with you, some of you live, and just all of your friendship and reaching out and being part of this series has meant a great deal to all of us. Thank you for being learners together. Next session is going to be with Dr. Laura Shaw-Frank, who is the scholar in residence at AJC and is a wonderful teacher. I think Shai knows as well. She's going to on Hanukkah, so we're going to have a big break. And please, let's get back together with latkes and, well, in my family, eggnog, which I know is not very Jewish, but was Jewish in my house. And hopefully some jelly donuts in December. But I want to give a big shout out to Rabbi Sarah Berman, who really is the engine behind all this. To Jake, to Carolyn, to Chelsea, all the help. Thank you again, Shai. Thanks to everyone. Have a great Sunday evening. Thanks for being together.